Good morning, Ram, and good morning, Christopher.
Good afternoon, Baiba, and good morning, Ram.
Good afternoon, Baiba. Pleased to meet you. And good morning, Christopher. You are not so far from me, like you said.
This is correct. I mean, we are very excited about this. This has been a long time coming, putting this together. Professor Rao is a man of the world and always traveling to different places all around. So it was great that we could finally catch him here at home in North Texas, not far where I am right now. But yeah, we're joined by very distinguished Professor Ram Rao. He's a founders professor of marketing at the Naveen Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas. And over the course of his very long career, he's worked at this really interesting intersection of marketing science and real-world application, including collaborations with pioneers like Frank Bass, who many refer to as the father of marketing science. And some of you might be familiar with that last name Bass, as it is also that namesake for the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, for which Frank Bass's name was part of that sponsorship. His work often sits in this really interesting part of the discipline that a lot of actual marketing practitioners don't even know exists, because few have really spent time inside of that harsh reality of how markets actually behave. And marketing science has this interesting reputation. It's known to be very precise, very mathematical, sometimes very unforgiving, I should say, and a little distant from the messy everyday practice of what we do in the world of advertising or marketing beyond. But that's exactly why these conversations matter, is to open up those spaces and to give more awareness to the work and the great work that's been going on for some time and continues to go on helping us better understand how real buyers buy and how markets move. And to be honest, that's a big reason why this podcast and why brandLingual exists in general. Professor Rao has spent decades not just developing theory, but really helping shape how that thinking connects to the real decisions that companies have to make. He's also a leader behind the famous Frank Bass Forums Conference, which just celebrated its 20th anniversary this year. It's the Frontiers of Research and Marketing Science Conference, where PhD students come from around the world and papers are selected and they present to one another. And it's a really fascinating moment to see some of the best and brightest of the next generation of marketing science all converge together and collaborate. So whether you come from academia, agency side or client side, this is really a chance to hear from someone who's been very, very, very close to the foundations of the field and who's been so up close to how those foundations actually hold up once they meet the real world. So Ram, we are delighted to have you. Welcome to brandLingual.
Thank you, Christopher, for that very kind introduction. I'm honored actually to be with you all. I think I will share what my experience has been, and I'm also looking forward to learning something. I always try to learn from every exercise, and also it's nice to be in an international setting with Berlin, North Dallas, all participating. So I'm looking forward to this. Again, thank you very much for that very kind introduction.
Okay. At the heart of brandLingual's podcast, we are always placing one big question, and we are asking this question to every guest that we have interviewed. And the question is, what are the things that you have learned at the beginning of your career and later on, practicing and learning more, you have unlearned? And that has been like a life-changing revelation for yourself.
Okay, so I came into marketing a little bit from a slightly different direction. When I was doing my PhD, I was doing more mathematical things than economics. So my original work was really on competitive behavior, competitive strategies. You can think of it like that. And especially about how do you compete so you get ahead of somebody else? It's literally like a race. We're thinking about races. So this was my original work. And clearly it was, for the time, it was more than 50 years ago, it was topical, it was very interesting, it was well received. And there was a lot of interest both from academia, mostly from academia, but also from practitioners about how to use this kind of thinking to form strategy. So I really was much more in strategy from a practical point of view, and then economics and math from academic point of view. But then I decided that the work that I had done would be much more applicable to marketing, because marketing is all about competition. And at the time, a lot of the thinking about competition was not as people weren't doing too much on that. So that's why I switched to marketing. That's how I came into marketing. But over the years, what I also discovered was marketing is really empirical in nature, meaning you have to work with data and you have to figure out what's actually happening out there, as opposed to trying to impose a sort of a structure, a competitive structure, a game theory structure to how actually things happen. So my big switch was, and I learned actually quite fast within the first 10 years, is I became much more of an empiricist. I started looking at data. And even when did, I went back to doing competitive strategy, and I continue to do that till today. I'm much more conscious of the consumer behavior and the data that's actually generating what's going on out there in the marketplace, and then trying to marry that with my work on competitive. So in a sense, I learned from being a theoretician to an empiricist. That's the big learning that I made, and that has helped me to understand markets a lot better.
That shift to empiricism and finding those generalizations, speaking as a practitioner, builds a lot of competence and confidence when we are enlightened and opened up to this kind of thinking, because we can then walk into any meeting in any category, and there are some law-like patterns or some assumptions that we can make about how markets actually operate at scale. And sometimes the realities around those learnings are very confronting to the untrained or uneducated marketer in the room, who has their own feelings about how things work and how something's better than something else, or how their better customer really behaves. And the collision or confrontation between those two storm fronts can often cause quite a bit of lightning and thunder. But the value of having that confidence of knowing that there are at market scale these law-like patterns and generalizations that are useful. I mean, you've contributed to many of these that now we sometimes take for granted when we step in and start to understand how markets move. You did quite a bit of work on then helping Frank Bass take his diffusion theory and actually modernize it and apply it to some of your messy competitive market signal thinking as well. So thank you for that to begin with. But yeah, the shift from theoretician to empiricist, how did that rewire your brain, or how do you look back on a former version of yourself and think differently about that theoretician versus where you are today?
But it happened because, actually, you mentioned Frank Bass already. It happened because of him. And in the sense, I knew this. I realized this. My first job was in Canada. I was teaching in Queen's University, Canada. And at the time I was teaching, some introductory marketing, but also I was teaching production management and strategy and so on, because I was a strategy guy. When I decided I wanted to go into marketing, I decided I needed to go to the guru, the person who knows marketing, and learn from them. So I decided there were two other schools that I looked at, but Purdue was one of them, where Frank Bass was there. And I actually just wrote a letter to three rather distinguished professors and said, I would like to come and visit your university for a year or two, because I want to be in marketing. I don't know if people do that kind of thing. I did that. And Frank called me a week later and said, yeah, come on over. I want you here. So I don't know what he saw in me, because all he knew was a piece of paper, some work that I had sent him. And then when I got there, I was continuing to do what I was doing before. One day, I proposed a problem to him. And this problem was about pricing of computer chips. I was thinking at the time much more about how do you do some competitive pricing, or, as you said, or a horizon, not just one period, but over maybe several months or several years. How should you price in the beginning? Should you have penetration pricing, or should you have skimming, or whatever? And I took that problem to Frank, and I I solved the mathematical structure of the competitive strategy and gave it to him. And I said, what do you think? And a week later, he came to my office and dumped a big FTC report, about 500 pages with lots of data in it, on my desk and said, I want you to look at this over the summer and then come back to me. I said, okay, all right, that's what I'll do. And I looked at the data, and it was, it was all published data. A lot of it was about early electronic devices like diodes and stuff like that. But then later on, integrated chips, both linear and digital integrated chips, which we don't talk about today, but this was back in 50 years ago. And then I looked at the data and I worked on it. But I was at the University of Chicago for a year at the time. And I went to the leading econometrician there, Zellner. I took my work, showed it to him, and I said, what do you think? I'm not sure I'm doing this right. He said, come and present this in my workshop. I said, okay. But then he said, oh, I'm sorry, my dates are taken. So I went and presented in a different workshop in Chicago. And the guy who later on became dean in Chicago was there in the audience. And he listened to me and he said, Ram, I think this one doesn't make sense. So I went back, and it was to do with the empirical work. Because he was a good theoretician, he said, this doesn't match the theory too well. You need to fix this. So I went and fixed it. And later on, that became a very well-received paper in Journal of Marketing Research. And it combined the theory and the empirics. So Frank had a huge role to play by dumping the data on me and saying, do something with it. That was my turning point.
That's a very cool story.
Yeah. You mentioned that it was 50 years ago, and I just got curious about how marketing has changed, in your opinion, since you started to be a professor, and how you see marketing nowadays.
And then I'll speak to a little bit about the academic side, because that's also changed. Both have changed. I think on the practical side, what we're looking increasingly is the availability of data has changed marketing, in my opinion. And these all started actually with supermarket scanners back in the 80s. And, the Jerry Eskin started this IRI, Information Resources. And before that, P&G was the leader in consumer non-durable markets. And marketing was associated with companies like P&G. They did a lot of advertising. They did a lot of new product testing. They always came out with fantastic new products. They seemed to have the pulse of the consumer and how to bring products that help the consumer, but also they were going to make a lot of money off. They were very good at that. But IRI changed the way they started doing the business, because now they started looking at consumer purchases, and they could actually monitor who bought, what did they buy last time, how much did they pay for it, what other product was available, what was on sale, what was on coupon, all kinds of things like that. And also what products were moving. Before that, most of the data was inventory data, as you know, which is you see on the first week how much was there, on the third week how much was there, so that what was sold was between the two inventories. That's how they calculated. But this was much more point of sale data. So the point of sale data is what changed. But now what I'm looking at is the kind of data that's being used is even more interesting, because on the one hand, we can monitor, not everybody, we can monitor certain people that are doing their business on the web. Especially here in the US, we can monitor more than you can in Europe because of GDPR kind of things, regulations. But so that data has been substituted. And now we don't have to look at only supermarket or store level data. We can look at what they're doing in their home, for example, at night. What are they searching for? How do they choose hotels, airlines, all kinds of things like that. So I think that the idea that we can look at consumers with a fine, what I would call like a microscope as opposed to a macroscope, that is what is the big change. Now, that can be disturbing to some people, but it's not just, we can also look at what other merchants are doing. We can look at everybody at a microscope. We can look at what Microsoft is doing every day. We can look at what Apple is doing every day. It's a little bit harder. They have barriers, but people are getting around it. People know what's happening inside these corporations a lot more than they did, say, 20, 30 years ago. So I think it's the data revolution is what I see as a big change, which means what? Statistics. algorithms, computers. How do you so computer scientists have come into marketing now. Statisticians have come into marketing big time, and this is changing the way things are going.
So not only the quantity of data, but the quality of data at different levels of gradation of scales. So we can go all the way out to just really, really, really big macro behaviors, and then we can compare those sets of data versus sometimes as if by random sort of strange individualistic behavior, and then see that full range and not have that gap in between.
And if I may be permitted, I want to go back to history a little bit and tell you how primitive the data was when first marketing moved from being sort of, all boys stories to a little bit of data analysis. This happened in the 60s, actually, the late 60s, and Ehrenberg was one of them. So I want to bring in Ehrenberg here. And what they had was they had data on purchases, certainly of gasoline, maybe a few other products at the household level. And all the data they had was, okay, you bought gasoline in the first week of April at Shell. And then in the second week, you bought in 7-Eleven. The third week, you bought at Thompson, whatever else. So they had which brand of gasoline, in those days there were lots of brands, the people bought on different purchase occasions. And what was their concern, which is a concern today for marketers, is loyalty. Every marketer says, I want to have highest loyalty among my consumers. It's a sort of the holy grail. Loyalty is the holy grail. We're still searching for it. And what they said was, there isn't any such thing as loyalty because people go all over the place. However, some people to go 80% of the time to brand A and 20% of the time to brand B. Other people like to go 60, 20, and a third brand 20, whatever else. And this is called multi-brand buying. And Ehrenberg, with his colleague Goodhart, Goodhart was a statistician, also both of them based in London, and both of them had also worked with Unilever. Later on, they did a lot of consulting work. They took this data and said, don't go after loyalty. The first thing was, don't go after loyalty, which may be a little bit, maybe it's overstating, but they said loyalty is the holy grail. It's not that easy to get at. And then, in fact, Frank also worked on the same thing, and he came up with a very important theory called the theory of stochastic brand switching, which is, he formalized it, he developed much better models and so on and so forth. So there I'm connecting how this data thing moved people away from an intuition of loyalty. I think I can get them to be loyal if only I get them to do something here or something there, if I give them a little coupon or whatever else. What they were buying was not loyalty, but there is something called multi-brand buying. And today we have much more sophisticated ways of looking at it. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. But that's what I think, that is the connection about data and how you take the data and either blow away some myths or come up with new strategies, both. I've given you an example of blowing away a myth, and I can also talk about coming up with new strategies.
Please. Let's talk about myths and strategies.
So the loyalty is a little bit of a myth. It is the holy grail, meaning it's not difficult to get at. So the strategy where very interesting work was done out of MIT by Urban and so on. And Urban, was the dean at MIT for a long time. It's called pioneering. Many people understand it as pioneering. It's also in economics is known as first mover advantages. Now, what did they do? They had access to data, IRI data actually, in many product categories. But they had data about market shares of products over time. Let's say when there was one brand, the first light beer, and then there's a second light beer and the third light beer. They wanted to understand, if you're coming second, what is the penalty for coming second or third? So they took the data and they came up with this idea of pioneering. In fact, the way I teach it is the square root law, because it's not quite a square root, but roughly if you come second, your market share relative to the pioneer is 1 over square root of 2. If you come third, it's 1 over square root of 3 and so on. That's a rough back of the envelope calculation. There are other factors, but you can use that to figure out what your market share will be relative to the pioneer. Everything else being equal, but everything else is not equal. people who come later can do better because they can innovate. So that's what they found from the data. But later work, including some that I did, and I'll tell you about the one that I did because I know about it. What we did here at UTD with a former student of mine and a colleague was we took the same data, we added some other things and said, hey, let's ask what have firms been doing over time? So in the beginning of the 20th century, the gap between the first mover, the pioneer, and the next one was quite large. And if you come towards the second half of the 20th century, that gap keeps getting smaller and smaller because managers have figured out that if you wait too long, you're going to be really hurt. And then we did a little bit of data work. And of course, I had done this earlier work with Frank to show that you need to come faster. And then we married the two and showed that one of the strategies that you have to employ if you are not the pioneer is to come faster. And economists have figured out what a pioneer should do if they come, what's their best strategy is to actually what they call, what I teach as Starbucks strategy, which is to saturate with all the locations as much as possible. So in a product market, it means having many varieties, many sizes, many variations, many options, things like that. And that prevents the entry of the second person. They can't find holes in the market, right? So there was the data, and they came up with, showed that the pioneering does matter. But then the strategy is, if you're a pioneer, you should occupy all the positions. If you're a follower, you should come as quickly as you can. And the thing that doesn't matter so much is pricing. What seems to matter is coming up with a better product if you're coming later. That does make a difference. A significantly better product, not just a small variation. And some advertising also can compensate, but the pioneer can also advertise. So there's some advertising effect and product design effect, not so much of a pricing effect. So we know a lot more about pioneering now than we did before. And we know how to use it.
And so in the end, so pioneering is about flooding the zone. It's about availability. So in other words, it's like increase that physical availability best that you can. That's that stronger force that you have, right? And in the end, you still have a weak force, which is advertising, which can also play its role.
Yes.
But it's not that the advertising ever supersedes the availability.
Right.
And thus it's finding this cocktail mix between the two. And this can be very confronting to many advertising clients who want to believe that advertising works in this very strong deterministic fashion, that you can narrowly define a better customer and just spam them hard enough, and then that's how they're going to fall in love with your brand, etc. And this pioneering concept really gets back to being the one that's easy to find, being the one that's easier to buy.
Yeah. And, on the advertising thing, actually, which is kind of interesting because it's a difficult task to measure the exact effect of advertising. That's why people can get away with making claims which are difficult to disprove or prove with great confidence. What do I mean by that? Again, let me bring back Frank into the conversation. This was one day I was in Frank's office, and then he was looking at some annual reports. And then he says, Ram, I could tell these companies how to make a lot of money in just 1 year. I said, he said, Coca-Cola can make a ton of money in 1 year. I said, what do you have on your mind, Frank? He said, they shouldn't advertise for a year. All that money will be going into their bottom line. They may lose a little bit of market share. I doubt it. They're not going to lose a lot of market share. And they can make a ton of money. He did counter a little bit weekly, but then I pointed out to him his earlier work and I said, it's not that simple. It turns out advertising has a lot of competitive role. And I'll explain that in a very simple way from way back when. It's actually, Frank had done this work on cigarette advertising because there was widely available data when TV advertising was banned in the United States for cigarette advertising. This was in the 60s. So FTC had a lot of data about the sales of cigarettes before the ban and after the ban. They could still advertise in newspapers and magazines and billboards. So I think radio possibly, I'm not sure. But TV was gone. They made a ton of money in the next few years. the relative market shares were stable and the sales were still growing because the population was growing, among other things, and people were still smoking back then. The point of it is, if I don't advertise and the other guy does something, he may steal my market share, so I'm going to advertise. So in a way, a manager may be right saying, I need to advertise. I don't have a problem with that. But they should understand it's only because the other guy might steal. And if you don't think the competitive can steal easily, if you believe that, or if you have data to prove that, then you don't have to advertise that much. So advertising now depends not so much on convincing the consumer sometimes, but rather on the ability to defend your position in the marketplace and how susceptible are people to advertising. And also there can be a wrong kind of advertising. I want to give an example of that because we are here in North Dallas. We're a high-tech area here. Back in 1983, a computer company called the Osborne Computer Company went broke. It was a hugely successful microcomputer company. Now, why did it go broke? Because they advertised what they were going to come out in the future model. Now think about this. Why would they advertise an improved model that's going to come next year? Because they wanted to prevent their customers migrating to a competitive product, which was today in the marketplace and which was better there than their existing product. But guess what happened? People who would have bought their product still decided to either wait or buy the competitive product. They had no sales for a year, and then and a lot of marketing fails because you run out of money. If you run out of money, as you know, a corporation has to declare bankruptcy, and that's how Osborne went. So it also matters in terms of strategy, what you advertise, when you advertise, and that's based on a theory paper that a colleague of mine and I did to show that it matters when you make what's called product pre-announcements, that these can be actually a double-edged sword. And we prove why it is, and then we give Osborne as the example. Yeah. So advertising can be good or bad, but it's a competitive thing.
You mentioned that there are a lot of myths in marketing, and one of them is loyalty. What are some other myths that you could point out?
Well, as I said, advertising is partly a myth. The other one actually has to do with, I've noted 4 of them. I want to pick one more. I think I'll pick on the new products because that's related to Frank. So the new products, if you bring out a non-durable product, let's say some sort of today it might be an organic product of some kind. And there was a lot of studies on that. And it turns out that these products, they have to hit 2 things that happen. The first thing is their sales are highest in the beginning because it's a new product. And then some people, they're not interested and they drop off. But the new sales, the maximum impact of a new product is in the beginning, and then it declines. So there was a work by a couple of people who were practitioners, Fort and Woodlock, who came up with this idea. But then Frank Bass took that and said, that's not necessarily true for durable products. Why? Well, durable products are risky products, expensive products. You want to buy a refrigerator. Today, it's not so expensive, but let's say you wanted to even buy a computer or some machine in your house, like a floor, vacuum cleaner or something like that. The best thing is to ask somebody who owns it and say, hey, how does it work for you? So it's more like a disease pattern. So new product strategy actually changed after Frank came up with this idea that new products grow slowly in the beginning. They don't grow fast. And the reason they grow slowly is because people are not sure about what this product is. But as there's more people that have the product, then it picks up. And now I'm going to bring you to the 21st century for electric cars. There's a very interesting piece of work done about 3 or 4 years ago by a PhD student at the University of Chicago. What did she do? She did a very simple study, collected data in a very simple way. She lived on the south side of Chicago, University of Chicago, and she got data on how many electric cars were actually on the road. The sales picked up more. In other words, in those areas where there were more, there are many other factors she controlled for income and all these other things. But the point of it is Now, what if from a strategy point of view, what does it tell you? It tells you that initially you can advertise a lot. The initial advertising will help a lot. And somehow you need to get people to use the product and other people to be able to see the use, not just, do you see what I'm saying? So we now think that observational learning is a current word that people use in behavioral economics. So think of the problem as consumers learn from observational learning. They look at what other people do, and influencer marketing can be thought of like that. Why? When I teach influencer marketing, this is what I tell my students. I said, influencer marketing works in part if the users believe that the influencer actually used the product, not endorse the product, but use the product and can speak to it. So oftentimes you will see them playing a video game or something very fast, and they can actually demonstrate how the product works and how they're getting joy out of it. And a lot of the influencer marketing is done by people who are participating in these games or something, or some other beauty products, It's not endorsement. Endorsement is very different. When Michael Jordan endorses Nike, he may wear Nike, but he's not thinking Nike is making him the world champion, but he's endorsing. Influencers are actually, that's observational learning. So that's a little bit of a different strategy. And you can then, if you're a good marketer, you start to think about for which products would you want to have influencer marketing and not for not. And I'm sort of leaving you with the thought. You're the practitioner. I think where observational learning is important, influencer marketing will be more effective.
Yeah, it's that form of social proof, and which we know has been a very strong evolutionary fitness advantage that we've had over the course of our hundreds of thousands of years, where
Absolutely.
we see
Learning from each
people.
other.
Yeah, we see people eat this strange berry that we just came upon, and they did not wake up the next morning. So maybe don't eat that berry, and eat this other thing. And yeah, it's a kind of like existential wayfinding. Now, there's some great evidence nowadays that actually suggests that creator or influencer marketing is now at a, say, level of impact in both the long and the short, relative to television, because of its reachability, but also because, to your point, it's not endorsement, it's actual product usage. And if those products are actually very distinctive in their look, the cosmetic industry has done really, really well at this because of the packaging of the cosmetics is still visible during that whole period of usage, as opposed to many products, once they leave their container, they become
Yes.
a commodity like everything else. And so, yeah, those products that have packaging that is also very, very, very noticeably distinctive and unignorably that brand, perhaps leave those stronger memory structures that then allow for all those things to compound and work together at scale. So you say that's how you're teaching it now.
I tell them that, but I tell them that I'm not just making up the story. I have evidence to show that these sorts of things happens. And then I show them an old commercials. You're an advertising man. You would like this. There's a commercial for Life cereal. In this commercial, there are a whole bunch of kids. They've been given Life cereal by their parent for breakfast, and nobody wants to eat it because they've never had it before, and they're not sure this is good. So they find one kid who's the youngest kid who can be bullied, Mikey. Hey, says, "Hey, Mikey, why don't you try it?" You've seen that commercial.
Oh, yeah.
Mikey tries it, says, and everybody says, "Oh, Mikey likes it," and everybody has it. That is an early form of influencer marketing. That's what I try to tell them. So I connect the University of Chicago, and that's how I try to teach these days, so that we bring the latest things that are going on in the practice of marketing. Influencer marketing is very big. It was never there before. And then people want to know, what is it? And then say, there are theories which we can try to frame it under so that allows you then to think about when and how to use it. What the theory allows you to do is to get a deeper insight into execution of the strategy. It doesn't actually say the profitability necessarily, because that depends on other factors, but it does tell you when not to use it, when is it more likely to succeed, that sort of thing. Yeah. But the life commercial also, I show them all these three things, and then I think they're convinced that influencer marketing matters.
Marketing often behaves as if the outcomes can be controlled with just the right message or just the right strategy. But from your point of view, how much of growth is actually predictable and how much is outside of our control?
When you say predictable, I want to frame this a little bit more carefully, because at the individual level, you can only give a probabilistic measure, right? So all the AI tools and algorithms, the way they work is they use the so-called logit model, basically, which gives a probability that this is what's going on, including your, the reader. When you're texting and you type half the word, it predicts what the word is going to be. Sometimes it gets it wrong. Sometimes it gets it right. Mostly it gets it right, but then it's tailored to your style and so on and so forth. The point of it is, so we now understand that at the individual level, you can only predict in a probabilistic way. All right. What about in the market level? How would you go about doing this? There you're trying to predict the average and then some sort of a standard error around that. So from a statistical point of view, you might be able to predict decently. Some things you can predict well, and other things you won't be able to predict. What are the things that you'll be able to predict is things like market share, which sort of gets averaged. Will you be able to predict actual sales very well? Probably not, because sales are buffeted by many other factors that are difficult to know. New product success is one of the more difficult things to predict. And that's why there's so much emphasis on new product testing and lots of models, as you know, in your experience, that people have used, because it's kind of difficult to know which product is actually going to succeed despite all the consumer behavior that we get. But conjoint analysis has been a great tool for that. So I want to give a plug to conjoint because I use that in my class regularly. They do a project on conjoint. Also, conjoint has kept up with data collection in a very nice way, as well as on the statistical side. They use very extremely sophisticated statistical methods. Conjoint turns out to be the one that has helped us design products better, but I don't think it predicts sales that well, but it does tell you which design will work better than which, and the relative merits of the designs. But I think forecasting shares is easier than sales. That would be probably correct. Forecasting existing products is better than new products. And then there's a lot of mystery that we just can't say anything about. But, the economy also is very important. And that we know how roughly to do, except we can't predict the economy itself. If there's a recession, we know what will happen to sales. But do we know whether there's going to be a recession? We don't. So there's a second level of uncertainty. In other words, what influences sales is uncertain. Then what do you do? So the inputs themselves are uncertain, and it's a problem. Yeah. It's an imperfect answer, but that's what I have.
For an imperfect world.
It is an imperfect world. My colleague did a very interesting piece of work on new products. They wanted to understand why it is that craft beers seem to be popular in some parts of the country and not in other parts of the country. So they wanted to predict sales of craft beer everywhere. And it turns out that a lot of it depends on the age composition. In other words, it's simple once you know what's going on. Where there are a concentration of younger people, craft beers take off. That's all it is. Now, that seems like some sort of an inertia on the part of older consumers. People who were struggling to figure out, they really came up with a very neat little model to show that's all it is. It's people like a change. Young people don't want to do what their dads or moms did. At least that's their explanation. And that would be difficult to forecast, I think, for craft beers initially. But once you see the data, I think you can do it. So now you know where to go.
That's right.
Again, that has a strategy implication, right?
Absolutely.
Why is such a resistance from the practitioner side towards academia and scientific language and research findings? Because what we observe is that there's like a huge gap and there's also a huge resistance in between.
I agree with you 100%. And I think I will offer you what I think is going on, because I deal with changes in academic world, and a lot of times there's always new language that's coming in, and then I don't know the new language because my training was older, and then I read and say, oh, but we used to call it something else. It's the same thing. It's no different, right? So there's a lot of that translation that's being lost first. The second thing I think has to do with incentives. Academic incentives are what? Let's say this young lady from Chicago, I think she went to NYU or Columbia to teach. I think she's a very beautiful result. Is she taking to the practitioners and helping them and so on and so forth? No. She's trying to get a permanent job, tenure job. And so she's focused on just writing for the other professors in the world. Do you understand what I'm saying? I want to contrast that with my colleague, who I have very, very high opinion of. He just got tenured, actually. He's a young man from Korea, and University of Chicago graduate. What did he do? He actually figured out that instead of just having statistics, if you do A/B testing, which is very, very important today, how should you evaluate an A/B test? And it's actually a path-breaking work that he has done. It's a very simple thing. And he shows that depending on what your upside and downside risk is, which products should pass the test. Not just based, in other words, A/B test is, okay, how much better did this is true for advertising copy as well. This copy generated more clicks or whatever else, let's say, right? Was it statistically significant? Then do it. No. He says it doesn't have to be statistically significant. It has to do with the loss function. It's a beautiful paper. It's a theoretical paper. But he was very clever. He took it to Harvard Business Review, and hopefully they've already published it in a short version. He's hoping that they publish in a longer version. But the effort to take it into the practical world doesn't pay off for them initially. That's one reason. And the practitioners, they have their own timeline, they have their deliverables, they have their things to do, and they're not sure that this will work, right? So they're not sure what these people are saying matters, because I have experience and I know that this is what's going to work. Why do I need this person coming and telling me they have this other idea which might work or might not work? I think that will change. Is it the data that's going to help in the end? Because you have to convince somebody by showing, look, it's happening, and I can tell you why it's happening, instead of just saying, I think this is a good idea. So far, a lot of the academic thing has not been data-based, or what we call empirically sound, evidence-based. Now, I think and as you know, in practical world, all businesses talk about use cases. What are use cases? Use cases are generating data to figure out if something works or not. That's what a use case is. You use it somewhere, see if it actually matters. And so it's a lot of A/B testing, use cases, and I think data will help bridge the gap. But there's also, I want to put a little plug for the Forms conference. More people should be attending conferences, and businesses may be able to afford to send some of their colleagues to these conferences, not worrying about whether it's going to have an immediate payoff. And if they can do that, I think there'll be more, because, Christopher coming to our conference, for me anyway, in fact, I pointed some work to him on advertising copy development, which could be very interesting. But I think that's the main thing. I wanted to leave you with another Frank Boss Texas thought. He once told me that, we won't name the school, some very famous school. He said, they'll never understand research. They would think only practical things matter. And I said, Frank, why do you think that's the case? He said, most academic research is a waste of time, but only in hindsight. You don't know that when you're first doing it. But the conjoint, has changed new products completely. And I teach that in that class. The conjoint was developed in 1971, and the theory behind it was by Paul Green at University of Pennsylvania. But 15 years earlier, people at Harvard had developed the mathematical theory that said it could be done under these circumstances. So it took 15 years to take it to the academic marketing world, and another 10 years to take it to the field work, which Rich Johnson did mostly. And then Rich Johnson founded the company, Sawtooth, and then it took off. So I think the gaps are there. It can be bridged. It will take some time. And since it's Texas, it's like drilling for oil. If you drill for oil in Texas, most of the time, all you get is mud Occasionally you get water. Okay, you got water. Very, very rarely you hit oil. And when you hit it, it's very big. So drilling is mostly a waste. If you just count the number, in other words, if you just count, I drilled 85 times. How often was it successful? Maybe once. I'm wasting time 84 times. Well, that's what you have to do. So academic research is like that. And I think the data will help give more confidence to invest time by the practitioners and try a few strategies out. Maybe with A/B testing, that's also allowing people to do some more testing. Testing used to be very, very expensive, by the way. When I started my career, market testing was in those days, it was several $1,000,000. Today, we can do A/B testing for several thousands of dollars. I think that also helps.
I encourage people to seek out more information about the forums conferences. We can put a link in the podcast information. It happens at the end of February every year. And again, there's a really interesting turnout, mostly from academics, although I did notice a heuristics expert from Spotify come in from Sweden, and you've got some other people coming in interested how to apply things. There's a particular ritual that you do at the end of the paper presentations. It's with the discussant.
Yes.
And where the discussant has 15 minutes to then reflect upon what was said, to reinterpret it. It seems as if the discussant and the original paper author were not in collusion, as if there was some separation between church and state. And I think that ritual of having an outside peer come in and then evaluate and have fresh perspective is something that we in practitioner land could actually benefit from as well. And just our own strategies and thoughts and thinkings, and have someone bring in some oxygen from the outside. Could you talk a little bit about that ritual of the discussant
Yes,
for
I
anyone?
can. Actually, you just gave me an idea. So first, let me thank you for it. Maybe the discussant ought to be a practitioner. Okay, that's what I'm thinking. Well, thank you very much for that. So the discussant is it comes from academia. Economists have been using it for a long time because the purpose of the discussion is to improve the quality of the work and to allow the audience a greater appreciation for the work. Because the person who's presenting their idea is very wedded to the idea. So oftentimes they're only, so this is a type 1, type 2 kind of thing. So they're living in this bubble world. And the discussion should take you out of the bubble world to see the merits of this, as well as not so much to put it down, but to see how it fits in the. And sometimes you say, it doesn't fit into. You're saying this could be actually done in practice. This couldn't be done in practice for these following reasons. If somebody could tell, that's a good idea, right? Then you go back to the drawing board and improve that. Like I told you, when the University of Chicago, this guy in the audience told me, what you're doing is wrong. So I went and fixed it. So it's both for the audience and for that's why there's no collusion between it's not a review. It is a discussion. And the discussion should be broader, ideally. It's not always, but the best discussions are. I think what you're saying is very good. And I've actually participated at least in one that I can remember. This was when Eastman Kodak was doing very well. There was a strategy person there. Then they wanted to carry out some strategy, and they invited 4 of us. It was a competitive strategy thing, so I was one of the thing. And we weren't really consulting, like doing something that could be deliverable for them. They just wanted to pitch their idea for us to listen and then express our reaction to that. That's all they wanted. So, like what you said. So there may be, but then you have to identify the right academics for it, and coming to the conference will help you to do that. I think that's part of it. And you have to build a network. You have to be in the network, otherwise you don't know. And many of the examples I gave today is very recent things, is because I am still very active. We have a lot of conferences. I go to all the conferences. We are having also other visiting speakers. And then we are hiring people. So I know what work is being done where, and I can bring this University of Chicago young woman's work to the table because I've heard it. That's why. If I haven't heard it, what do I know about it? Because it takes 4 years to see it, and there's so much work going on. How do you identify one piece from so much? So I think your idea is fantastic. But at forums, let's implement that. Let's get a couple of practitioners, maybe You can be one of them, but mention it to my colleagues who are organizing the conference. But we can also get other people in town, as well as if somebody is coming from the Spotify guy, by the way, has a PhD. I want to tell you that. That's what I meant. So on the other side, as people are trained in the sorts of things that academic people are doing, there will also be more collaboration, like there is in finance.
Can I go one step back and still talk about the language? Because when you mentioned that there are young talent who is also coming into academia, and they are bringing in, let's say, relabeled concepts. And from your extensive experience, is that actually these concepts are relabeled. Can you talk a little bit more and give some sort of examples?
One of the things I have encountered actually is what's called social networks, right? What are the implications for marketing to address because of the networks? The networks can create, as you know, and I teach a case on something called United Breaks Guitars. So this has to do with United Airlines breaking a musician's guitar, and then he makes a song, puts it on YouTube, and then because the YouTube has its social network, the people who watch it, and then it goes viral and all these sorts of things. So the virality and the social networks thing. But this is actually related to the earlier Frank Bass work of diffusion models, which is observational learning. So you could think of social networks also as an observational learning problem. And people don't make the connection, because then you can use some of the techniques developed there for both for strategy as well as for methodology to prepare. So that's an example. Another example that I can think about, and I want to be careful here. Let's see what I have here. Yeah. So, okay, this is a crisis for us in teaching. Let me share a crisis I have as a teacher, and you can tell me how I can solve this problem. And I ask my colleagues this: what are we teaching our students, the MBA students? I know what I could teach MBA students 25 years ago. What should I be teaching now? Why? Because they can type their question. I have a new product, some information about it. They go type to AI and say, what do you think? What's a good pricing strategy? Can you tell me the 3 good pricing strategies or something? So it goes and, it'll produce 3 pricing strategies. So why are they coming to college to learn? What am I teaching them? The way I'm thinking about it is, when people are focused on only producing answers, then that's why the language problem comes, because they're not paying attention to the connections, the discussant, which Christopher talked about, the bigger world in which their contribution or their work is being placed. If they could do that, I think the language problem will be reduced. They'll use both languages, or they'll say, this is what I'm calling it, but this has this kind of relationship to the other thing. They have to establish that connection. To me, that's the most important thing. So when I teach, I want them to be able to use Claude or OpenAI or whatever else. I don't think, because it's the world, everybody's going to use it. But I want to teach them in a way that they can connect it to whatever they've learned, so that when they look at those 3 things, they say, so this is because of this. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it's the same idea that the language is because of inadequate understanding of the bigger world. That's all it is. I don't think it's because people are focused on very narrow things. I need to get an answer to this, instead of saying, how is the answer generated? What is the context in which? Could this be somewhere else? What's going on? And I think that's what we want to be teaching also. And once people get that idea, I think they'll do a lot better. I think there'll be more openness for academics to listen to practitioners, and for practitioners to, to be patient and say, yeah, I think what they're saying is probably something like this. And they can ask, this is our experience. Is this what you're thinking about? And so they can have that conversation. So there are 2 different worlds, and we want to connect them. That's how I see the language. And that's how when I talk to Christopher, that's what I do. So, by the way, their agency helped one of my students a long time ago to do an experiment with Conjoint in Richard's group. They recruited all the people and everything else. So I wanted to do one thing about where we're going. I already told you our problem about teaching. But I think from a practical point of view, the availability of AI and tools will call for a different challenge for managers. This is what I think. And I've been asking people about this, which is, and I've asked Christopher about this, about his creative group. Richard's group has been known as the most creative agency, if not just in Texas, but in the country. It's a very, so their strength is in the creative group. Now with AI, how do you organize that creative group? I think that's going to be the key thing now. In other words, there was a time when the creative group consisted mainly of people who were good at jingles or who were good at producing, were good lines, comical lines or things like that. But today they may still be needed, but you may also need some other types of people as a team, right? So the team that emerges in the practical world or in practice is going to be different. And I want to understand how firms are thinking of making these teams different. It won't be the same as we used to have before, because I think AI will change the tasks, the importance of the various tasks. I don't know what you think about it. I think teaching would be like that in the academic world. We'll have to teach differently. And I'm thinking actually of teaching with a lot of people from the real world coming to class and doing it that way. It's going to be difficult, but I'm going to try to do that in one of my courses, mainly because I think the students I know, they're saying, oh, I can find the answer. What are you going to tell me?
Yeah, it's that, I think it was Sam Altman who said, knowledge is going to be free. Anyone can be intelligent for free with little effort. And so it's a pretty low bar for the concept of intelligence in the way that he's using in a very sort of fast food transactional way. The piece you brought up based on Baiba's core question, the idea of translation and bridging between dialects and understanding that you can have two groups of people talking about exactly the same thing, but because their words are different, they feel like they're talking past each other. But if they understood and were more multilingual or bilingual and understood these different dialects, they would actually be able to port over the assumptions from one to the other and then unlock, like maybe decades of learning on a particular concept when they realize these two things relate. But if we haven't taken the time to understand the theories and the fundamentals and we've jumped just straight into practice, pick up the language of the time, but we don't have the historical context. And so it's encouraging more of that translation and portability between those words and those worlds. Because then when those worlds come together, they can do bigger things together than they could have done individually.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. The whole point of scaling up is to have this broader understanding, innovation. You can do things that nobody's thought of yet because you have a broader understanding. Otherwise, you can only do things that people already know, which is what AI tends to be, more or less. So can I ask you all a question? What do you feel, since I'm from the academic world? I have been at this for a very long time. And one of the things I should probably tell you about Frank Bass a little bit more is, what is it that made Frank Bass such an important person? Was two things happened. One is, in the late 50s, the Ford Foundation in this country sponsored, they said business education is very backward. We need to get people to be more up to date. So they took a bunch of professors and trained them in statistics, econometrics, and some economics and so on, and said, hey, guys, go and look at data and start to think about it in a more formal, rigorous way. So Frank was one of the people that participated. Not everybody went and did what the Ford Foundation hoped they would do, but Frank did. And then he wrote a fundamental paper on the diffusion of new products. And then, because he became such a popular thing and everything, they appointed him as the editor of the Journal of Marketing Research. To the people who appointed him were very unhappy with his performance because he changed the journal completely. He made it completely a statistical heavy journal. And they said, well, you're forgetting all the old stuff that we used to do, about retail margins and all that sort of stuff. And then he said, well, this is a new world. He took some flack for it. And then he helped to found the Marketing Science Journal as well as the Society within the concept of the Management and Operations Research Society. So he was also president of those societies. And then the journal came by, and I've been associated with him. And then at UTD, he did something phenomenal. When we came to UTD, there were only graduate students. There were very few undergraduates. There were no freshmen or sophomores, just some seniors and juniors. He said, I think we can do something here. And we produce a lot of PhD students. In fact, our PhD students were the most sought after around the world for a while. And one of our students, early graduates, 1986 graduate, went on to become the dean of Kellogg. And UTD was like a no-name place. Nobody knew about it, right? It was not a brand name school or anything. He became the dean at Kellogg. And another person went to Stanford and so on and so forth. So we built a reputation, which is why we have the Forums Conference where we get such good attendance. We still have very good marketing people here. And instead of boasting about UTD, I should say, he played a big role on these several things, which is why I think he's such a giant. And he did dump the FTC report on my desk. So he also did that.
And if you hadn't done that, perhaps you wouldn't be here today, right?
I think I would have gone in a different direction. Yeah.
That's
Given up marketing and gone back to doing economics and strategy. I don't know.
Well, you were going to pose a question to us, which I was excited to hear.
So the question is, how should MBAs in particular, or even undergraduates in business, what kind of education do you feel would serve best the industry? What should they learn here?
Yeah, I mean, Ram, you mentioned a little bit earlier that practitioners are doing their things in a way that they have practiced for a long time. But what we have observed and what we are talking about in brandLingual is that most of those kind of like approaches or ways of doing things are very intuitive. And there is this gap between, let's say, empirical evidence and then intuitive way how to do things. Because scientific approach or what empirical evidence shows is actually unintuitive, some sort of like a story, or it gives this feeling that, hey, I don't feel like the markets or brands should need to do things in this way. But according to data or some sort of statistics, it actually works like that. It's just that it's not intuitive for myself. So some sort of like a very generalized joke is that in university, when you take a bachelor degree, at year one, you are learning a lot of theory, a lot of core concepts, how you need to think about marketing or how you need to think about, I don't know, brand or about the advertising. Then on year two, you are together with your peers or your course mates, and you are starting to practice some sort of things through the, I don't know, course tasks. And then on year three, you are starting to do things alone because you are preparing your final thesis or bachelor thesis. In advertising and marketing, things are operating quite opposite. First, you get a job, you don't know anything about the fundamentals or these key theories, and you are just trying to practice alone. It's in this some sort of mindset, swim or drown. If you start to swim, almost like a little dog, you just try to survive, you can get into the group of other peers who are doing the same thing. And now you have a group of people who are trying to just swim. And then if you get across that level and you are like, you are getting more senior, then you only start to realize, hey, actually, I want to understand some sort of fundamentals or basic concepts, how actually I should need to build these, let's say, key things together to actually make some sort of success for my client. And Christopher and I, in brandLingual, we are talking about advertising, marketing, and brand in the context that it's almost like a periodical table when we talk about the fundamentals. And if you know the fundamentals or periodical table, then you know how you can actually make the success. But if you don't know those key things, then, you try to create magic.
I'd love to know about this periodic table because that's one of my favorite examples about theory is that how somebody figured out elements that nobody knew existed, but said these things should be there. That's what Mendeleev did. He just said, oh, that should be there. I don't know. And then people found those things, right? Actually, they found them. Periodic table is I'd like to know more about the marketing periodic table that you all have developed. But one idea that what I'm getting from you, Baiba, is, I've had industry speakers come to my class, for example, but what they typically is to share their own experience, but without the, you asked me how I moved from being one kind to a different kind, and I showed you the story. They don't talk about their success stories, and they talk about, basic ideas today and all that. They think they want to train them in what's going on in the real world. I want them to give their personal experience of what they found challenging and how they overcame the challenge. And I don't know, maybe I should give them the instructions to do that. But I hate to tell people what they should talk about. I just say, come into my class and talk about it. And they always talk about, the latest, well, these days we do it like this. And that's all they. So it's more like stories.
Right.
They don't talk about the periodic table, the challenges. Maybe I should get you to come.
That's a great idea. There's maps for these territories that many of us don't understand. And in some cases, some of it's willful ignorance. You don't want to think there are law-like patterns or very kind of elegantly at market scale predictable things that you can see. You would rather things feel very improvisational in the moment and spontaneous because that suits your personality and that suits the lifestyle that you aspire to be a part of, this like creative flying by the seat of your pants. And you love to embrace change. But I found most people in my industry absolutely abhor change. They hate it. They fall into a groove in which they think they know what they're doing and they've locked it in and they don't want to change that. They don't want to unlearn. They don't want to open up to a current better understanding of how things might work. And if you go back into other parts of the world, the medical world, for example, I mean, we would still all be using leeches and letting the blood out and all this other stuff, had there not been someone saying, I think something else is going on here. And thus having a true appetite for change, I think comes from just a pattern of lifelong learning and learning from your failures. Like we love to talk about all of these revisionist history moments of how we magically,
Right.
A plus B
That's my
equals
point.
this
Yeah.
equals this. But then when those happen every once in a while, but the conditions behind the failures might actually be more telling than these seeming anomalous events where you might succeed, thinking that you did everything the same way. But underneath the surface, there was some other condition at play that was increasing the odds of success. And if you don't direct your attention to that, you'll just keep you just keep doing rain dances thinking it's going to rain. And sometimes it doesn't. And you wonder about how high did you jump or what were you wearing or how many people were dancing. And like you start to attribute all that kind of stuff. Like that's still the same human. And we still have all of this, prehistoric, hardware and software operating. And so I think the fact that we don't open ourselves up to that as modern day practitioners and realize that we can also be very delusional and fallible. And yet there's a lot of smart people like yourself and all of your colleagues around the world who have actually helped us figure out that there's phantom bridge in front of this is 3 times as sturdy than you think it is.
And the periodic table needs to be pushed around a little bit more on both sides.
We're going to be very appreciative of your time. You've given us more than we've asked. But again, I want to encourage everybody to learn more about Professor Ram Rao. We're going to make that easy to do in our podcast description and comments and our inevitable LinkedIn posts and promotions that we'll have around this particular episode. We'll also link to the Frank Bass Forums conference that I mentioned does happen the end of February. I think like clockwork every year. It just celebrated its 20th anniversary. There are some amazing video commemorative talks that were shown during the luncheon that I think is also available online. Of Frank, his colleagues. Ram was certainly involved in that, which I thought was quite touching. And there's some really great, amazing advice that needs to be spread around our industry. So we'll link to that video as well. And we're always excited about, whenever we get a chance to chat, you've always got 2 or 3 more projects somewhere in the world that you're interested in doing or reaching out for connections, of which I've got some other great connections for you to link into. You provide us wonderful connections and continue to inspire us. And so I hope this broadens, your own voice and gets you out there and other people can discover, what you've got going on there at Naveen Jindal School of Management. And yeah, we're very, very excited to have you as a part of our conversation, Ram.
Well, I want to thank you, and I am honored, and it was absolutely a delight to talk to both of you. And also, I'm just thinking, you've just sold me on maybe visiting this podcast more often and checking out what y'all are doing. And there's much to learn, and also to be part of the network, because I think this learning from each other is promoted by the network. So I think what y'all are creating is a network, and eventually that network will produce the results that I think will be a force for good.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. We would love to find some students at the next Forums conference too that we can bring on to this podcast as well and
absolutely.
close those gaps.
Yeah, we'll do that.
It was super interesting to hear your reflections on our questions and also your explanation about the gap between academia and practice. So yeah, thank you very much for the conversation.
Lovely morning. Thanks again.